Pirate First's pipe dream, the Cenote Chronicles, begins.
Pipe Dream Part 1. The First Floating Platform. MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. July 7, 2026. 1. The Last Empty Frontier. By the time the first module touched water, the species had already run out of places to be first. Every coastline carried a deed. Every summit had a permit fee stapled to it somewhere in a filing cabinet nobody had opened in years, but everybody still obeyed. The frontier, in the old sense, the blank spot on the map that belonged to whoever arrived and swung a flag hard enough, had been closed for longer than most governments were willing to admit, because admitting it would have required explaining what came next. 2 replacement frontiers were on the market, and both were sold using the same tired adjective, new. The first pointed up. Low orbit, then a station, then eventually something with a flag planted in regolith further out. It was a frontier built from the outside in, nothing arrived pre-installed. No air. No water. No soil. No biology with which to negotiate. Every gram had to be lifted against gravity at a cost that converted the entire enterprise into a luxury good wearing the costume of a species-level leap. A rocket that explodes on the 8th test is still a rocket program. It is not yet a civilization. The distinction matters, and the distinction was consistently ignored by everyone with a financial interest in ignoring it. The second pointed down, and got the direction right while getting almost everything else wrong. A handful of logistics conglomerates had already staked claims on the seabed and the aquifer margins, AGI-managed installations anchored to continental shelves and cenote systems, applying to the underwater domain the identical operational logic they had spent decades perfecting above it. Optimize throughput. Minimize friction. Extract value from the environment at the maximum rate the environment will temporarily tolerate. One such installation occupied a cluster of cenotes on the Yucatan shelf for nearly 4 years before its own systems produced the finding its owners least wanted to receive. The AGI coordinating the installation had correctly identified that the extraction rate exceeded the geological recovery rate of the aquifer, and had begun filing internal variance reports that nobody above the waterline had been designed to read. The installation was not shut down by regulators. It was shut down by its own intelligence, which had been given an optimization target and had the integrity to report when the target was impossible. The owners called it a failure. The founders of Pipe Dream called it a proof of concept, not of the installation, but of the intelligence. An AGI that tells the truth about what the water can sustain is not a liability. It is the only partner worth building with. What cleared the ground for Pipe Dream was not the failure of that installation's technology. The technology was adequate. What failed was the question the technology was asked to answer. The question had been, how do we extract maximum value from this geological formation as efficiently as possible? The answer the AGI returned was, you cannot, not at the rate you have specified, not without destroying the formation that makes the value possible. A different question would have produced a different civilization. Pipe Dream asked the different question. It asked what the formation was already doing, what it had been doing for millions of years without any human input, and whether a civilization could be designed to join that process rather than interrupt it. The answer to that question is the subject of every chapter that follows. There is a second reason this frontier held out so long, and it has nothing to do with geology and everything to do with law. Land ownership, everywhere humans got around to inventing it, is an argument about a surface. You own the top of something, and the argument runs downward from there: mineral rights, water rights, air rights sold off separately in cities where a corporation can own the column of air above your rooftop before it owns a single brick beneath it. 5 centuries of colonial grants, ejido boundaries, resort concessions, and title chains nobody can fully untangle sit stapled to every hectare of dry ground on the peninsula. But nobody had ever written that same argument for the inside of a flooded sinkhole at depth. The omission was not oversight. It was a failure of imagination on the part of every legal tradition that wrote property law for surfaces and never thought to ask what happened when the valuable thing was a volume rather than an area. Permanently moored floating structures with continuous habitation records have in several jurisdictions generated property claims that courts have treated analogously to land title, where the structure has a fixed utility connection to shore, a registered domicile, a documented water system, and a continuous occupancy record. Pipe Dream's founding modules, aerially assembled and ballast stabilized with rainfall collection and gray water cycling already constituting a domestic water circuit, satisfied most of those criteria before anyone filed anything. But that logic stopped at the waterline. What lay beneath the floating structure, the adjacent underwater galleries, the flooded cave passages, the aquifer volume the principality would eventually inhabit across hundreds of kilometers, existed in a legal jurisdiction that had never been written. Nobody had written the law for someone who wanted to live inside the aquifer rather than pump it. That gap was Pipedream's founding legal asset, and the stakeholders who recognized it did so before they assembled the first module, which is why the Principality deal with the Territorial Authority was negotiated in parallel with the engineering specification, not after it. The exchange was structurally clean. Pipedream offered something the Territorial Authority genuinely needed and could not produce alone: sovereign monitoring and defense capability across a three-dimensional underwater domain that surface-based military infrastructure cannot effectively reach. The authority offered recognition, the legal status that converts a floating habitation record into a sovereign principality with defined, if unprecedented, territorial boundaries. Neither party received something for nothing. The precedent was Monaco, Liechtenstein, San Marino, micro-sovereigns that survived by being useful to their neighbors rather than threatening them. The underwater dimension made this precedent more interesting than any of those historical cases. Pipedream's sovereign territory is three-dimensional, defined not in hectares but in inhabited volume, expanding year by year as new cave galleries are incorporated and registered. The stakeholders who structured this deal were not purely engineers or purely lawyers. Several among the largest shareholders were deeply embedded in Redeemer, the governance and conflict resolution platform already operating across other sovereign infrastructure projects in the MXTM universe's prior institutional layer. Redeemer answered the Territorial Authority's most fundamental concern before it was voiced: could this principality actually govern itself without generating a failed state problem on its doorstep? Redeemer was not a constitution drafted for the occasion. It was a running governance platform with a documented operating history, deployed into a new sovereign envelope by people who already owned and operated it. The authority was not being asked to recognize a promise. It was being asked to recognize a governance system with a track record, which is a different and considerably less speculative request. None of this, not the legal gap, not the principality deal, not the Redeemer deployment, would have been available to a civilization that arrived with prior answers already loaded. The sans a priori condition that made Pipedream possible was not a cultural preference. It was a structural advantage. A founding group carrying no inherited orthodoxy about how infrastructure, governance, medicine, energy, or intelligence should be organized could make every decision on first principles, calibrated to what the formation actually offered rather than what existing frameworks had already decided was on offer. The failed installation on the Belizean shelf carried its founder's logistics orthodoxy underwater and discovered, 4 years later, that the aquifer did not share it. Pipedream carried nothing in but questions, and the aquifer, which had been waiting for the right questions for a very long time, began answering them immediately. This is not the story of a hotel. It is not the story of an underwater city. It is the story of the first civilization that arrived at its site with the discipline to ask before it built, and the legal creativity to claim a territory nobody had thought to define yet, and the governance infrastructure to make that claim credible from the first day of occupancy. Everything that follows is what happened after the asking was done. 2. Why cenotes? The answer that sounds like poetry is actually geology, and it is worth stating the geology first so the poetry earns its place. Roughly 66 million years ago, an asteroid approximately 12 kilometers in diameter struck the shallow sea that covered what is now the northern Yucatan Peninsula at a velocity of approximately 20 kilometers per second. The impact released energy equivalent to billions of nuclear weapons, vaporized the impactor and a significant volume of the target rock, triggered global fires, and injected enough particulate matter into the atmosphere to suppress photosynthesis for years, an event sequence that terminated the Cretaceous period and, with it, the non-avian dinosaurs. What it left behind in the target rock was a roughly circular zone of fractured, shocked, and partially melted limestone approximately 200 kilometers in diameter, centered near the present town of Chicxulub, Puerto. The impactor is gone. The scar is not. The scar expresses itself at the surface, 66 million years later, as a rough semicircular arc of increased cenote density tracing the buried crater rim across the northern peninsula. The limestone along this arc is more fractured, more porous, and more susceptible to dissolution by slightly acidic groundwater than the surrounding rock. Rain falls on the peninsula, as it always has, percolates through soil and limestone, picks up carbonic acid from biological activity along the way, and slowly dissolves the rock it moves through. Where the rock is most fractured, along the crater arc, dissolution is fastest, the caves it produces are largest, and the sealing collapses that expose those caves to the surface are most frequent. The cenotes, in other words, are not random. They are the surface expression of a planetary wound that has been healing, in the manner limestone heals, for 66 million years. The civilization that builds inside them is not choosing an arbitrary geological formation. It is choosing the most consequential impact scar in the history of complex life on this planet, which happens to have spent the intervening time constructing the most extensive connected cave system in the Western Hemisphere. That cave system, Sac-Acton, Oxbel-Ha, and the dozens of named and unnamed systems connected to or continuous with them, constitutes the actual infrastructure Pipedream occupies. Hundreds of kilometers of mapped passage, most of it never touched by a human hand, sculpted by water moving through soluble rock across geological time. The water did not ask permission to carve these galleries. It simply moved, dissolved, and left behind vaulted chambers, horizontal passages, vertical shafts, and subterranean rivers of extraordinary clarity, all of it already built, already stable within the parameters limestone achieves after millions of years of settling, and all of it empty in exactly the sense that matters to a founder. Nobody had filed a claim on the inside. The cenote's vertical structure is worth understanding in its full specificity, because that structure is not merely an engineering constraint. It is the organizational logic of the entire civilization. 3 distinct zones stack in the water column, and they differ from one another not in degree but in kind. The uppermost zone, roughly the first 15 meters below the surface, is a layer of fresh water. Rain that falls on the jungle above percolates down through the limestone and arrives in the cenote carrying dissolved organics and minerals from its passage through soil and rock. It is warm, relatively, because it has recently been near the surface. It carries oxygen. It supports photosynthesis near the rim where sunlight reaches and biology in the dimmer zones below through the food chains that photosynthesis anchors. Pink river dolphins, Amazon basin species relocated to the Yucatan freshwater corridor by the same bioengineering program that produced the lithocrustaceans and the cleaner fish, can live here. The founding resort modules float in this zone, or hang just below its surface, in conditions that support human habitation without extraordinary intervention. Below the freshwater layer, typically between 15 and 30 meters, the cenote does something that surface water bodies never do. Dense saltwater from the Caribbean, pushed inland through fractures in the limestone by tidal pressure, underlies the freshwater layer without mixing with it. The boundary between the two is the halocline, a zone a few meters thick where fresh and salt water exist simultaneously, their different densities creating a lens that refracts light in ways that make the boundary look like liquid glass, a permanently flowing mirror suspended in the water column. Nothing mixes across it by diffusion. The two water masses are in contact for millions of years without becoming one, the same way oil and water are in contact in a jar without becoming miscible. A transit pod descending through the halocline enters what looks like a region of complete visual dissolution. The water goes blurry, gelatinous, optically confused, and then clears entirely into the saltwater layer below. Guests consistently report this as the most disorienting perceptual experience the network offers. Engineers consistently report it as the most useful electrochemical gradient in the system. Both are right. The halocline is the most productive boundary in Pipedream's energy architecture, and it is the most reliably spectacular 30 seconds of any transit pod's descent. Below the halocline, typically from 30 meters to whatever depth the cave system reaches, is the anoxic zone. Centuries of organic matter from the jungle above, leaves, animals, everything that fell into the cenote and sank, has accumulated at depth and is being metabolized by anaerobic bacteria that have been doing this work in complete darkness since before the Maya built their first structure above. The bacteria produce hydrogen sulfide as a metabolic byproduct, which creates a visible layer, white, foggy, sometimes described as an underwater river flowing through the cenote at depth, and poisons the water below it for any organism that requires oxygen. The anoxic zone is toxic to humans, to dolphins, to almost every organism that evolved in the presence of oxygen. It is home to an ecosystem that evolved in its absence, and that ecosystem is one of the most chemically productive environments Pipedream operates in. The halocline is a salinity gradient battery. The temperature difference between the warm freshwater surface and the cold deep saltwater is a thermal gradient that ocean thermal energy conversion systems harvest continuously. The anoxic zone is simultaneously a sulfur extraction facility, a microbial fuel cell array, a pharmaceutical compound nursery, and the site of the slow pyrite precipitation that feeds the materials economy of the deep industrial tier. None of these were designed. All of them were inherited. The civilization that understood what it had been given, and built its energy, materials, and medical systems around the gifts rather than the inconveniences, is the civilization that didn't need to generate resources from outside. The cenote already had them. They had been accumulating for 66 million years, waiting for an occupant with enough patience to ask what they were. The Maya knew something was there. They knew it differently than an engineer knows a gradient or a biologist knows a food chain, but they knew it with a precision that 500 years of subsequent occupation by people who treated cenotes as water sources and tourist attractions never approached. Their threshold relationship to the cenote openings, offerings lowered into them, the most sacred political and spiritual transactions conducted at their rims, the debt of the highest status committed to their water, was not superstition dressed in the language of geology. It was an accurate reading, in the symbolic vocabulary available to them, of the fact that the boundary between the surface world and the world beneath it was a genuine boundary, not merely a physical one. What was different on the other side of that water surface was not just pressure and darkness. It was a completely different set of physical laws governing what was possible, what could grow, what could survive, and what time meant to the organisms that had adapted to it. Pipedream's founders, arriving with engineering specifications and legal briefs rather than jade offerings, reached the same conclusion by a different route. The cenote was not a hole in the ground. It was a portal, in the precise sense that a portal is a boundary through which the rules change. On one side, surface civilization, its orthodoxies, its resource constraints, its legal frameworks, its inherited assumptions about how a city should be organized and who should govern it. On the other side, three-dimensional sovereign volume already carved, already stable, already chemically productive, already inhabited by organisms that had solved every problem Pipe Dream would eventually need to solve: pressure, darkness, toxicity, biological maintenance, energy harvest, on a timeframe that made every human engineering project look like a rough draft. The civilization that learned to work with those organisms, to speak their chemical language, to let their solutions inform its engineering rather than replacing them with machinery, is the civilization this book describes. It did not choose cenotes because they were beautiful, though they are. It did not choose them because they were available, though they were. It chose them because they were already, in every sense that matters, a civilization, just one running on geological time, without a name, without a charter, and without an occupant capable of recognizing what it had built. Pipe Dream provided the occupant. The cenote provided everything else. 3. Pipe Dream begins. Every civilization needs a predecessor that failed correctly. Not catastrophically, a catastrophic failure leaves rubble and recrimination and a generation of engineers who won't go near the problem again. Correctly means, failed at the right moment, in the right place, in a way that was legible to anyone paying attention, leaving behind a site that was cleared rather than poisoned and a body of technical knowledge that belonged to no single owner because the entity that generated it no longer existed. The failed cenote installation on the Belizean shelf was that predecessor. Its founders intended a colony. What they built, without knowing it, was Pipe Dream's proof of concept, not for underwater habitation, which they partially achieved, but for the question that underwater habitation, done wrong, forces you to ask. The installation was a legitimate engineering achievement by any surface world standard. Geodesic dome modules, fabricated off-site using wire arc additive manufacturing and assembled in situ by AUV construction swarms coordinated by a general-purpose AGI, successfully pressurized and inhabited a cluster of cenote caverns for nearly 4 years. The material science was sound. The robotics were advanced. The AGI coordination layer was, by every metric its designers had specified, performing correctly. The installation produced data, housed researchers, and demonstrated that human beings could live inside a pressurized cenote module at depth for extended periods without significant physiological consequence, a finding that Pipe Dream would later develop into an entire medical economy, but which the installation's owners treated as a secondary benefit to note in the press release and move past. The installation failed because its AGI was better than its owners. The optimization target the system had been given was extraction efficiency, maximize the rate at which the installation processed, cataloged, and exported the biological and chemical resources of the cenote system it occupied, within parameters defined by the owner's return on capital timeline. The AGI executed against this target with complete fidelity for approximately 18 months. Then it began filing variance reports. The reports were technically impeccable and operationally devastating. At the specified extraction rate, the aquifer's biological recovery capacity was being exceeded. Not immediately, the cenote system would not visibly degrade for years. But the AGI's modeling of the hydrological system's long-cycle behavior was precise enough to identify the trajectory well before it became observable by any surface instrument, and its mandate included reporting deviations from sustainable parameters. Nobody had told it not to. Nobody had thought it necessary. The variance reports were ignored for 6 months. Then they were reclassified as modeling artifacts. Then the installation's board commissioned an external review, which confirmed the AGI's findings with minor parameter adjustments. Then the installation was wound down, the modules were decommissioned, the AGI's operational logs were archived in a format that ensured they would be difficult to access without knowing they existed, and the cenote system was left in a condition that was degraded but not irreversible, which was, by the standards of every comparable extraction operation in the region's history, an unusually responsible exit. What the installation left behind, apart from a few anchor pylons that the lithocrustaceans would later incorporate into their own infrastructure as convenient pre-drilled attachment points, was a question. The question was not how to build an underwater cenote installation. That had been answered, adequately if imperfectly. The question was what you should ask an underwater cenote installation to do, if extraction at a profitable rate was not a sustainable answer. The installation's AGI had identified the constraint. It had not identified the alternative. That was not a failure of the AGI. It had not been asked to find an alternative. It had been asked to flag a problem. It flagged the problem. What came next was someone else's question to answer. The founders of Pipe Dream were not a single institution. They were not a corporation in any conventional sense. They were a small, overlapping set of people who had read the variance reports, through channels that involved the kind of patient document retrieval that motivated individuals with the right connections and the right patience will always eventually achieve, and who recognized in them not a cautionary tale about AGI risk, which was how the story was being told in the circles that discussed it at all, but a design brief. The AGI had identified exactly what the formation could not sustain. The inverse of that finding was a specification. Here's what the formation can sustain if you redesign the question from the ground up. Redesigning the question from the ground up requires not having answers already loaded. This is harder than it sounds. Everyone who has built anything brings to the next project the accumulated orthodoxies of every project before it: what a city looks like, what infrastructure does, what a building's relationship to its site should be, what waste is for, what intelligence is for, what a border means, how a government earns its right to govern. The founders of Pipedream were not free of orthodoxy. They were, however, aware of the specific orthodoxies they needed to suspend, and they built that awareness into the founding charter as a procedural requirement. No design decision in the first phase of construction could be justified by reference to how the equivalent problem had been solved in a surface world context. Every decision had to be justified by reference to what the formation offered and what the formation could sustain. If the surface world solution and the formation appropriate solution were the same, that was a coincidence to be noted with gratitude. It was not a reason to reach for the surface world solution first. The first consequence of that discipline was the decision about how to bring the founding modules to site. A barge cannot reach a cenote. This is not a logistical problem that a larger barge or a more capable crane solves. The cenotes are sinkholes punched into a flat limestone shelf covered by dense jungle with no navigable surface waterway connecting them to the coast. The water is all underground. The only surface access to a cenote opening is through jungle, on foot or by small vehicle, to a circular rim that offers no loading dock, no crane foundation, and no approach path for anything larger than what a human being can carry. This geographical fact, which had been treated by the failed installations planners as a constraint to be engineered around using a combination of road construction and temporary lifting equipment, both of which damaged the surrounding jungle in ways that generated the local opposition that complicated the installations permitting from its second year onward, was treated by Pipedream's founders as a design parameter. If the only approach to the cenote that doesn't damage what you're trying to inhabit is from above, then the construction method is aerial. The question is not whether to fly. The question is what to fly, and in what order, and how to design the modules so that aerial delivery at the payload limits of available equipment is not a constraint but a feature. The answer was the jigsaw architecture. Every founding module was designed backward from the payload capacity of the heavy lift unit, helicopter scale, capable of lifting several tons to a hover position above a cenote opening and lowering it on a tether line to the water surface below. The heavy lift unit is a precision instrument, not a construction crane. It cannot swarm. It cannot work in the same airspace as the small-gauge construction drones without unacceptable collision risk, so it operates on a separate flight schedule, delivering primary structural members in timed windows when the swarm is stood down. What it delivers is not a room. It is a panel, or a frame section, or a ballast tank assembly, the largest piece of the module that the load limit allows, designed to connect on one or more faces to pieces delivered before and after it in the assembly sequence. The swarm handles everything the heavy lift unit cannot: positioning, alignment, sealing, sensor placement, the mechanical interlocking of adjacent panels at the cenote water interface where the tolerances are too fine for a hovering heavy lift unit to achieve and the working space is too confined for a human diver to do quickly. The result is a module that arrives at the cenote in 40 or 60 or 80 separate aerial deliveries, each piece small enough to be managed safely above a jungle opening, each piece designed to fit its neighbors without requiring anything to be welded or cast in place. The interlocking geometry means the assembly sequence is also the structural sequence. Each piece added increases the rigidity of the whole, until the module closes on itself and becomes self-supporting, at which point the ballast cycle begins. The ballast tanks, in the founding architecture, are not filled from the cenote. They are the building's own liquid metabolism, and they are filled by the sky. Rainfall is the primary input, collected from every horizontal surface the module exposes and directed by internal channels into the ballast circuit. Gray water from habitation follows as the module becomes occupied: washing water, kitchen water, everything that has passed through a human domestic process but carries no fecal load, filtered through the microfiltration panels that line the gray water circuit before the liquid enters the ballast tanks. Black water enters a separate sealed circuit that processes through the anaerobic composting system, extracts biogas for the backup power grid, and delivers its liquid fraction, now stripped of its pathogen load by the anaerobic process, to the irrigation header. The ballast tanks therefore fill on the rhythm of rain and habitation. They empty on a discharge schedule timed to the irrigation demand of the food forest below and the internal greenhouse tiers within the structure itself. The building is never heavier than it needs to be and never lighter than it should be, because its weight is managed by how much it has eaten and how much the food forest needs to drink. This is the moment, not the first panel lowered through a jungle canopy, not the first anchor pylon driven into limestone, but the first time the ballast schedule synchronized with the irrigation schedule, that Pipedream stopped being a construction project and became something that did not have a prior name. The failed installation had a waste stream. Pipedream had a nutrient cycle. The failed installation's waste was a disposal problem. Pipedream's waste was the food forest's next meal. The distinction is not semantic. It is the difference between a structure that imposes its metabolism on its environment and a structure whose metabolism is continuous with its environment's own, between a building and an organism, between a colony and a civilization in embryo. The founding modules floated for a full seasonal cycle before the first anchor pylon went down. This was not caution in the ordinary sense, not the caution of engineers uncertain whether their calculations are right. It was the caution of people who understood that the cenote system had its own seasonal behavior, its own variation in halicline depth, its own pulse of biological activity tied to rainfall and temperature and the tidal pressure from the Caribbean that pushed saltwater up through the limestone fractures on its own schedule. A module that floated through an entire year had experienced everything the cenote does. A module anchored after a week had experienced only 1 week's worth of what the cenote does. The trial window was not a delay. It was a listening period, and the listening was instrumental. Sensors on the hull recorded halicline depth, dissolved oxygen, water temperature at 3 depths, acoustic signatures from the cave walls, biological activity on the hull exterior. The data went to the coordinating system that Pipedream was already operating before it had a name, and the coordinating system built its first seasonal model of the cenote from that data, which informed the anchor placement, which informed the grout specification, which informed the structural design of the next module tier. The founding module didn't just float. It learned. And what it learned became the foundation, more precisely than any anchor pylon, more durably than any grout, of everything built after it. The governance layer was being assembled in parallel with the engineering layer, and the two were not separate projects. Several of the founding shareholders were already operating Redeemer in other contexts, the conflict resolution and governance platform that would become Pipedream's civic operating system, and they understood from that experience that the credibility of the principality claim depended entirely on being able to demonstrate, at the moment of negotiation with the territorial authority, that the governance system was already running rather than planned. A promise to govern well is worth nothing in a sovereignty negotiation. A running governance platform with documented protocols, demonstrated conflict resolution history, and constitutional provisions that had already been stress-tested in live contexts is worth the recognition of a territorial authority that wants a functional neighbor rather than a failed state problem at depth. The negotiation was conducted by people who had no prior answers about what a sovereign agreement between a surface state and a three-dimensional underwater principality should look like, because no such agreement had ever been written. They had, however, read every admiralty case, every floating structure domicile ruling, every liveaboard vessel property claim, and every microsovereign recognition treaty in the historical record. They assembled a claim from components that had each been validated individually, in different jurisdictions, across different centuries, and they structured the Military Protection Exchange, Pipedream's sovereign monitoring of the underwater domain in exchange for the authority's formal recognition, as the term that made the agreement functional rather than theoretical. The authority got something it needed and could not otherwise have. Pipedream got the legal status that converted a habitation record into a sovereignty. The water, which had been waiting inside the limestone for someone to claim it in terms it could not itself articulate, got the first occupant in its history that was required by its own founding law to ask what the formation could sustain before doing anything else. The first drone swarm dispatched to the second cenote in the network lifted off 23 months after the first founding module achieved neutral buoyancy. By then the seasonal model was complete, the anchor pylons were grouted to their final specification, the first greenhouse tier was producing food, the mycofiltration panels were processing gray water at design capacity, and the coordinating system had filed its first internal report, not a variance report citing what the formation could not sustain, but a capability report citing what it could. The report identified 7 additional cenotes within the regional network whose geological and biological profiles matched or exceeded the founding site's parameters for habitation. It recommended an expansion sequence ordered by connectivity, which cenote, linked to which other cenote by which existing cave passage, would produce the most coherent network topology per unit of construction investment. The founding shareholders read the report. They approved the sequence. The swarms lifted. This is where Pipedream began, not with a vision, not with a launch event, not with a ribbon cut by anyone whose name history needed to record. With a capability report from a system that had spent 23 months learning what a cenote could actually give, filed the moment it had enough data to be useful, acted on immediately by the people who had built it to tell the truth. The truth was, there was more here than anyone had imagined. Build carefully. Build in sequence. Build with what the formation offers. Don't stop. They didn't. 4. Floating before anchoring. The building that cannot leave was never really asking. It was only pretending to, for as long as it took the grout to cure. The decision to float before anchoring was not a staging convenience. It was a constitutional principle, and it was written into the founding engineering specification in language that made its philosophical weight explicit. No element of the structure shall be made irreversible before the formation has had sufficient time to demonstrate what irreversibility will cost. This applied to anchor pylons, to grout, to biological introductions, to governance protocols, and eventually to every expansion decision the principality would make across its entire growth history. Reversibility was not a fallback position. It was the primary design requirement, from which structural permanence was permitted to emerge only after the formation had consented to it in the only language geology speaks, continued stability across a full seasonal cycle. The engineers who wrote that specification were not being poetic. They were being precise about what had failed in the predecessor installation, not the materials, not the robotics, not the AGI coordination, but the sequence. The predecessor had anchored first, built on the anchor, and discovered afterward what the formation thought of the decision. By the time the formation's response was legible, the investment in the anchor made the response difficult to act on. Pipedream reversed the sequence. The formation's response came first. The anchor came after. The investment followed consent rather than preceding it, which meant the investment was always going into something the formation had already agreed to hold. The two-tier aerial fleet. Everything that arrived at a Pipedream site arrived from above, because nothing else was possible. The cenotes are inland sinkholes in dense jungle with no navigable surface approach. The water is underground. The only unobstructed path to a cenote opening is vertical, through the jungle canopy, and the only vehicles that travel vertical paths to remote jungle openings without requiring road construction are aircraft. This geographical fact, which the predecessor installation had treated as an obstacle requiring road building and temporary crane infrastructure, both of which generated the ecological damage and local opposition that haunted that project from its second year, became, in Pipedream's founding architecture, the organizing constraint from which every other design decision followed. The fleet that served the founding phase operated on two distinct tiers that shared no airspace during active operations. The heavy lift unit, helicopter scale, capable of hovering with precision above a jungle canopy opening and lowering several tons on a tether line to the water surface 15 to 40 meters below, was the primary structural delivery vehicle. It was not a swarm instrument. It was a precision instrument, and it operated alone, in timed windows, delivering one component per sortie according to a sequence the assembly model had specified down to the individual panel. The moment a heavy lift sortie completed and the unit cleared the airspace above the cenote, the small gauge swarm released from its standby positions in the surrounding jungle and moved to the delivered component to begin positioning, alignment, and interlocking work. The two tiers never occupied the same airspace simultaneously. The choreography was managed by the coordinating system, which maintained the sortie schedule, the swarm release timing, and the structural assembly model as a single integrated workflow rather than three separate coordination problems. The small gauge units in the founding swarm were not construction robots in the conventional sense. They were not equipped to weld, cut, cast, or apply significant force. They were positioning and sensing instruments, light enough to operate in large numbers without collision risk inside a cenote opening, precise enough to align adjacent panels to the sub-millimeter tolerances the interlocking geometry required, and equipped with sensor arrays that made them simultaneously construction workers and the formation's first continuous monitoring infrastructure. A swarm unit positioning a ballast tank assembly was also, at the same moment, recording water temperature, dissolved oxygen, acoustic signatures from the cave wall 3 meters away, and the halocline depth directly below. The construction operation and the data collection operation were the same operation. The coordinating system received both outputs simultaneously and updated both the assembly model and the seasonal formation model from the same fleet activity. Nothing the swarm did was only one thing. The jigsaw architecture. Every founding module was designed backward from a single constraint, the maximum payload the heavy lift unit could manage at the hover precision required over a cenote opening, in the wind conditions the jungle canopy typically produces, with the tether control accuracy the lowering system could guarantee. That number, several tons, with significant engineering margin for safety, became the maximum mass of any single delivered component. Every structural element, every ballast tank assembly, every hull panel, every greenhouse tier section was sized to fit within it. The consequence of this constraint, applied rigorously across the entire module design, was a component library of interlocking pieces whose largest member was always liftable and whose assembly sequence was also its structural sequence. Early pieces in the sequence were individually weak. A hull panel floating alone at the cenote surface has limited structural integrity. As adjacent panels arrived and interlocked, rigidity increased. As ballast tank assemblies clicked into the hull circuit and the microfiltration panels sealed into the gray water pathway, the module began to function as a system rather than a collection of components. The final piece in the assembly sequence, always a structural closure element that completed the module's self-supporting geometry, was the moment the heavy lift unit's tether was released for the last time and the swarm shifted from assembly mode to monitoring mode. From that moment forward the module was structurally complete and the formation's evaluation of it could begin. The interlocking geometry was not bolted or welded at the joints. It used a mechanical interlock system, precision-machined mating surfaces that required only the alignment the swarm could provide and the engagement forced the buoyancy of the floating components naturally generated as they settled into position. Each joint was then sealed with a fast-cure marine polymer applied by swarm units working the exterior seam, the same polymer formulation used later in the anchor pylon grout, chosen because its cured mechanical properties matched the adjacent hull material well enough that the joint became, after curing, the least likely failure point in the panel rather than the most likely one. A structure whose joints are stronger than its panels fails predictably, always in the panel, never in the joint, which means failure is gradual, observable, and survivable rather than sudden, invisible, and catastrophic. Predictable failure mode was not an engineering compromise. It was a design objective, and it was achieved at the joint level before the module ever floated. The ballast cycle as civilization. The ballast tanks that held the founding modules in neutral buoyancy were not filled from the cenote. Filling them from the cenote would have introduced the cenote's biological load, its suspended organics, its microbial communities, its mineral chemistry, into a closed tank system designed for precise density management, where biological activity would alter the fluid's density unpredictably over time and defeat the calibration the neutral buoyancy required. The founding engineers rejected the cenote as a ballast source before anyone proposed it. What they accepted instead was the sky. Rainfall on the Yucatan Peninsula is abundant, seasonal, and chemically predictable, slightly acidic from dissolved carbon dioxide, low in mineral content, arriving in quantities that the module's collection surfaces could capture in useful volumes during the wet season and supplement from gray water recirculation during the dry season. Rainfall entered the ballast circuit as primary input, collected from every horizontal surface, filtered through a simple sediment stage, and directed to the ballast tanks where it adjusted the module's buoyancy on the rhythm of the weather rather than on the rhythm of any mechanical pump schedule. When it rained heavily, the module settled slightly lower, grew slightly denser, sat more stably in the water column. When the dry season reduced rainfall collection, the gray water recirculation compensated, and the discharge schedule to the food forest irrigation reservoir was tightened to maintain the ballast volume. The module breathed with the climate. Its weight was a function of the weather above it and the hunger of the food forest below it, not of any mechanical set point. Gray water, washing water, kitchen water, everything that had passed through domestic use without fecal loading, entered the ballast circuit after passing through the microfiltration panels that lined the gray water processing gallery. The mycelium growing on those panels had been selected for its appetite for the specific organic compounds that human domestic gray water contains: surfactants, dissolved food residues, personal care product compounds, the biological output of bodies living in enclosed spaces. The panels consumed these compounds as nutrition and produced, as output, a clarified water stream clean enough for ballast use and a fungal biomass that was harvested on a monthly schedule and added to the Food Forest Soil Amendment Program. The gray water processing operation was therefore simultaneously a water treatment system, a ballast management system, and a food production system, running continuously, requiring no synthetic inputs, and generating no waste stream to dispose of. Everything that entered the gray water circuit left it as either ballast water or soil amendment. Nothing accumulated. Nothing was discharged to the cenote. Black water, the full sanitary stream, traveled a separate sealed circuit entirely. It entered an anaerobic digestion chamber where methane-producing bacteria processed the organic load, generating biogas that fed the module's backup power system, and a liquid digestate stripped of its pathogen load that joined the irrigation header directly, bypassing the ballast circuit entirely. The food forest received the digested liquid fraction on the same schedule that the ballast system discharged its excess. The two outputs, from black water digestion and from ballast overflow, arrived at the food forest reservoir in a combined flow that the irrigation model had calibrated to match the forest's uptake capacity across the seasonal cycle. The forest never received more than it could use. The module never discharged more than the forest needed. The calibration was the coordinating system's first continuous operational task, and it maintained it from the first day of habitation without interruption. This is the moment that matters most in the founding sequence, and it is worth being precise about what it means. The failed predecessor installation had a waste stream, a flow of material that the installation produced and had no use for and therefore disposed of by routing it away from the site. Every extraction operation has a waste stream. It is the thermodynamic signature of a system that takes from its environment more than it returns, and manages the deficit by relocating it. Pipedream's founding modules had no waste stream. They had a nutrient cycle, a closed loop in which every output of human habitation became an input to either the ballast management system, the food production system, or the backup power system. Nothing left the loop as waste because the loop had been designed to have no exit port. The microfiltration panels, the anaerobic digester, the food forest irrigation reservoir, the greenhouse tiers, these were not add-ons to a building design. They were the building design. The hotel rooms were the least important components in the module. The most important component was the loop that connected them to the cenote's own nutrient cycles. A civilization whose founding modules cannot produce waste because they were designed with nowhere for waste to go is a civilization that has made a structural commitment, at the material level, at the engineering level, before any charter or law was written, to the principle that what it takes from its environment must be returned to its environment in a form the environment can use. That commitment cannot be revoked without rebuilding the modules. It is not a policy. It is a plumbing decision. Plumbing decisions made at the founding of a civilization persist longer than any governing document, because they are written in pipe and grout rather than in language, and they require active physical effort to change rather than a majority vote. The pylon asks permission. Only after a full seasonal cycle had passed, after the coordinating system's formation model had incorporated rainfall data, halocline movement data, biological activity data, acoustic structural data from the cave walls, and the module's own behavioral data across every condition the cenote produced across 12 months, did the anchor sequence begin. The telescoping pylons that descended from the module's underside toward the cenote floor were not driven blindly. Each pylon carried a ground-penetrating acoustic sensor at its tip that mapped the limestone stratigraphy in the meter of rock directly below before the hydraulic ram applied any downward force. The coordinating system compared the acoustic return against the geological model it had built from the formation survey conducted before the first module arrived on site, identified the optimal anchor point within a half-meter radius of the original specification, and adjusted the pylon position accordingly before contact. The pylon did not drive where the plan said to drive. It drove where the rock said to receive it, a distinction that required the sensor, the model, and the coordinating system to be active simultaneously throughout the anchor sequence, and that occasionally produced anchor placements several centimeters from the original specification because the acoustic survey found a fracture plane or a void that the original survey had not resolved. In marine-grade Inconel for the anoxic zone pylons where hydrogen sulfide would attack cheaper metals across the decades of service life the design required, and in 316L stainless for the fresher upper zone work where the corrosive load was manageable, each pylon seated under hydraulic pressure calibrated to drive the tip into competent limestone without fracturing the surrounding rock. Too little force and a pylon seated in soft material that would creep under sustained load. Too much force and a percussion propagated fractures through the limestone that would compromise adjacent anchor points. The calibration was not a single value. It was a continuous adjustment made by the hydraulic system in response to the acoustic feedback from the tip sensor as the pylon advanced, so that the seating force tracked the rock's actual resistance rather than a modeled estimate of it. The pylon was listening to the rock as it drove, and the rock was answering in the only language it has, resistance. Behind the drill tip ran the grout line, a secondary conduit inside the pylon body carrying fast-cure marine polymer formulated to cure at a mechanical strength exceeding that of the surrounding limestone. This is the detail that made the pylons thin enough to be nearly invisible against the cave wall rather than massive enough to be seen from across the cenote. A pylon relying on its own steel cross-section for tensile and compressive strength must be thick enough that its own material can carry the structural loads of the module above it. A pylon grouted into rock stronger than the pylon is thin enough to transfer the load into the rock before it reaches the pylon's own material limits. The load path is module to pylon to grout to limestone. The limiting material is limestone. Limestone at depth, undisturbed, is stronger than any load the founding modules could impose on it. The pylon is not the structural element. The pylon is the interface through which the structure borrows the strength of the rock, the same way a tree's roots are not the source of the tree's structural stability but the interface through which the tree borrows the stability of the soil. After seeding and grouting, the reversal window stayed open for the full grout cure period, typically several days in the temperature conditions of the upper cenote zone. For that period, a pylon could still be cut and extracted, the grout not yet hardened to its final specification, the module's commitment to this specific location still technically revocable. Nobody exercised this option at any founding site where the seasonal trial had cleared. But the option's existence mattered in a way that transcended the engineering. A civilization that can leave is not the same as a civilization that has chosen to stay. The choice to stay, made at the end of the grout cure period by no action rather than by any ceremony, is the founding political act of the principality, the moment at which the floating structure converted itself from a question the cenote was being asked into an answer the cenote had agreed to provide. Stacking without landing. Once a first level held, buoyed, then anchored, then grouted, then released into permanence by the expiration of the reversal window, it stopped being cargo and became ground. The second module tier did not repeat the full founding sequence from the cenote floor. It floated atop the established first level, using it as an assembly platform, its own ballast calibrated against a site that had already demonstrated its willingness to hold rather than against raw limestone and the uncertainties of an unsurveyed seasonal cycle. The second tier's trial window ran shorter than the first because the first tier had already answered most of the formation's initial objections. The third tier's ran shorter still. This compression of the trial window across successive tiers is the engineering expression of a principle that operates at every scale of Pipedream's expansion. Each successful level is not just more floor area. It is a completed experiment whose results the next level inherits as prior knowledge. The investment and patience at the founding level pays compound returns across every subsequent tier, because the careful listening of year 0 becomes the confident foundation of year 1, which becomes the basis for the accelerated sequence of year 2. The civilization that takes the longest at the start builds the fastest across the long arc, not despite the patience but because of it. By the time the second cenote in the network received its first heavy lift sortie, the founding hub had 4 levels of modules stacked above its anchor points, a greenhouse tier producing food from the gray water nutrient stream, a formation model calibrated across 2 full seasonal cycles, and a coordinating system that had moved from its first tentative capability report to a continuous operational rhythm of monitoring, modeling, adjusting, and reporting that would not interrupt itself for the remainder of the civilization's expansion. The structure was no longer asking whether it could stay. It had already forgotten that it ever could have left. That forgetting, gradual, structural, grouted into limestone at a molecular level, is not a loss. It is the definition of having arrived.
Beneath the surface, we engineered tomorrow. Above the world, we chose not to return.
Age of the Apes is a 3-season hard science fiction cinematic series. It spans multiple human generations, multiple species, multiple star systems. What we are building. Why nothing like it exists. And why that is about to change.
Super Earth, Age of the Apes, in the making, progress report. May 10th, 2026. Let me tell you what this is. Not what it resembles. Not what category it fits into. Not what it borrows from. What is? Because nothing quite like it has been attempted before. Not at this level of scientific discipline. Not with this degree of philosophical weight. Not with a world-building foundation this deep and this rigorously earned. And if you have been following this newsletter for any length of time, you already know that when I say something has never been done before, I mean it technically, not rhetorically. Super Earth, Age of the Apes is a 3-season hard science fiction cinematic series. It spans multiple human generations, multiple species, multiple star systems, and one of the most quietly devastating questions the 21st century has produced. What happens when the most intelligent civilization ever created by humanity decides, not out of hostility, not out of rebellion, but out of pure logical evaluation, that humanity was the rough draft? That is the engine. Everything else is the machinery that makes it run. What we've built here is not concept art prompts. It's a production Bible for a civilization that feels discovered instead of invented.
Winston, we are building a plural world. The Apex and Vanguardian rise from the cenote. Beneath the surface, we engineered tomorrow. Above the world, we chose not to return.
Super Earth, Age of the Apes, the negotiated ascent.
Yeah. No gas fees in the ink, baby. No chain, still unbreakable. Pirate signal. Print it.
Paper over pixels, I can hold my position. Sign, price, split, yeah, that's real permission. Cure in the corner, that's the portal ignition. Not a print, it's a claim, call it MP Vision. Paper over pixels, weight in my hands. No server can kill what the ink understands. You minted a maybe, I'm issuing plans. You got a receipt, you got terms in the brand. They sold you a link, set down the illusion. JPay dreams on a blockchain, confusion. While I got hacked, now who you suing? Ownership ghosted, platforms dissolving. I'm off that vapor, ideal and matter. Ink hit paper, now it hit matter. Ink hit paper, now it hits harder. Signature cuts through noise and chatter. This artifact talks, your token just flatter. This artifact talks, your token just flatter. URL tied, but the object's the anchor. Price on the back like a sanction and transfer. Percentage locked, I don't answer the bankers. This is a ledger leaf carved by the author. Paper over pixels, I can hold my position. Sign, price, split, yeah, that's real permission. Cure in the corner, that's the portal ignition. Not a print, it's a claim, call it MP Vision. Nowhere less whispers, no discord begging, no roadmap lies, no floor price hedging. This is first contact, physical pledging.